Okay, so today we're going to do something that's a little crazy. We're going to do an entire chapter in one lecture. So we're starting with a brand new unit, Unit 5, and essentially Unit 5 includes the causes, the events of, and the effects of the American Civil War. So really what today we're going to do is sort of set the scene. We're going to look at context and try to figure out what the United States looks like during this time period. So, the title of Chapter 12 is Living in a Nation of Changing Lands, Changing Faces, Changing Expectations. And so, this chapter is really unique because we're actually in the very same time period of what we had just recently studied with Manifest Destiny. Okay. Now, what we're really looking at, though, in Chapter 12 is more of the social history. So, how did people living in the United States conduct their everyday lives, and what were their experiences like? So, our objective is to demonstrate an understanding of how immigration, new debates over slavery, and an activist generation of women shaped the lives of Americans. So, we're going to be covering three different groups today. First will be immigrants, second will be slaves, and the third group will be women. And all of these groups experienced lots of different changes from the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. So, first in 12.1, the changing face of the American people in the 1840s and 50s. And really, 12.1 is about immigration. So, analyze how immigration from China, Ireland, and Germany, as well as the incorporation of Mexican citizens in the Southwest, changed the United States. So, definitely, the demographic makeup of the United States is transforming significantly during this time period. Now, from the 1830s to the 1850s, America is going to see a huge increase in population, and there are three major reasons for that. So, number one is increased immigration. So, that's what we're really looking at in this section. Immigrants from all over the world are flooding into the United States. Number two is manifest destiny. Okay, so as we expanded westward and acquired more land, especially from Mexico, we also inherit the people that are living on that land. So that's going to increase our population. And then number three is the increased births of native born Americans. So simply put, we just had more people being born in America and living longer. And that's because we had the market revolution. We are industrialized and we have better technology. And that's going to allow people to live longer. Okay. And of course, the food supply helps as well. So you can see from this graph when we're looking at the early decades of the United States in 1790, right? So this is where the chart begins. Our population is just a little shy of 4 million. But by the time we get to the Civil War in 1860, we'll be at over 31 million. Okay. And so population increase is just going to go up like crazy. We're going to be looking at immigrants from three different countries into the United States in these decades. And the first immigrant group that we're looking at are the Chinese. Okay, now just so you know, every immigrant group has what we call push and pull factors. Okay, so push factors are things that push people out of their country. So in this case, why are Chinese people leaving China? Okay, so that's what a push factor is. A pull factor draws immigrants to a certain location. So each of these immigrants that we're going to be looking at have different push and pull factors. Okay, so in China, the push factors included the Opium Wars. So these are wars over drugs. Okay, so these things are not good. China has a very, very high population as well. And with the high population, there wasn't a lot of land available for people that were living in China. The land is that was available is very high in rent, and due to the high population and competition for things like food and the opium wars that are going on all at the same time, there was famine and starvation. Okay, so people are going to be looking to get out of China. They're being pushed out of China and they're looking to immigrate to another country. Okay, so then what is the pull? So, why are Chinese immigrants going to be drawn to America instead of other parts of the world? Well, the pull factor was the availability of jobs, particularly in California and Hawaii. So, California and Hawaii are recent interests for the United States. We learned that we just recently acquired California. Hawaii is going to be coming very soon, even if Hawaii doesn't belong to America yet. There's still a lot of American businesses there at that time. And so initially, Chinese immigrants were really welcome to California and Hawaii because they were seen as well adapted for farming. Many of the immigrants who left China and come to the United States are farmers back in China. So they already know how to cultivate the land and do a lot of the work that needs to be done in both Hawaii and California. So the major pull is going to be jobs. However, as time goes on, more and more Chinese immigrants arrive to American shores, and the sentiment towards Chinese immigrants takes a really big and rapid turn. And here's the reason why. Okay, now typically speaking, the immigrants coming from China were primarily men that left China. Their goal is to move to the United States to make money, send the money back to China, and eventually moved back home to China as well. So the women stayed in China, the men immigrated to the United States, and many of the Chinese immigrants, they're going to view their stay in America as temporary. Okay, so why do they do that? Well, first of all, citizenship wasn't allowed for non-whites yet. So the Chinese saw no reason to, grab roots in the United States and try to stay here very long or long term, because what's the point? They're never going to be able to reap the benefits of citizenship. Okay, now why does this cause problems? Well, because many of the Americans view the Chinese as taking advantage of the American economy. They're working in the United States, taking wages away from potential American workers. And then that money isn't even being invested in America. Okay, so it's not being recirculated into American businesses and the American economy. Instead, the money is exiting America and going back to China. Okay, so if anything, it's going to stimulate the Chinese economy. And so this is really going to cause a lot of Americans to view the Chinese immigrants very negatively. Now, it's going to be even more evident that there is racism and discrimination against the Chinese as more and more immigrants arrive, especially because of the gold rush. Now, in 1848, we know that gold is discovered in California, and it is attracting people from all over the world. Okay, and of course, Chinese are going to come as well, right? So, Americans have already resented the Chinese. There's a lot of racism and competition for jobs. And now it seems like the Chinese are going to enter into the mines, extract this mineral wealth from our soil, and then again send it back to China. And so in California, many Americans are looking for ways to push the Chinese out of those gold mines. And one way they did that was through something called the Foreign Miners Tax of 1852. Now, the Foreign Miners Tax of 1852 charged Chinese miners $3 a month and taxed the Chinese miners simply for the ability to look for gold. So other miners did not have to pay this tax. $3 a month back then in 1852 is a lot more, right? It's a lot more than it is now, obviously. So Google it if you want to do the conversion, for today's currency. It's a very, very steep tax. And so the whole goal was to make this tax really high so that the Chinese cannot afford it. Okay. And then with the foreign miners tax, the Chinese can't mine for gold any longer. Now, the Chinese can't afford the tax, but they were already in America. Okay. So they're already in the United States. So what are they going to do then when they're in California? How are they going to find work? So Chinese immigrants are able to find work in other industries. They did a lot of dangerous jobs building the railroad for the Central Pacific Railroad. And now is the right time, especially remember with Manifest Destiny and Westward Expansion. So we're going to be looking for a way to connect coast to coast by laying the tracks and having that transportation. And so many Chinese immigrants became railroad workers, which is very, very hard and difficult. Okay. Now, additionally, there were some of the other dangerous jobs like dealing with explosives, trying to get through those mountain ranges. And Chinese immigrants went into mining, and they're going to go into things like agriculture and fishing as well. And Chinese immigrants also entered into industries like laundries and restaurants. So we'll talk about laundries and restaurants really quickly. So these are two industries that were previously sort of dominated by women. Okay, so it was considered women's work to wash clothes and cook food. But remember in California, as we go, throughout the West, it was primarily a man's world, right? Because mostly males are going out to the gold rush to look for gold. But that doesn't mean that the jobs were traditionally done by women any longer out west, right? So women are sort of no longer needed for that. So what the Chinese do is they enter into those industries instead. And so the Chinese will begin running laundries and restaurants. They will fill those jobs that had previously been sort of traditionally held by women. So Chinese immigrants came for jobs in farming, they came for the gold rush, and they were kicked off those mines and found jobs elsewhere. Okay. Now, the next group of immigrants we're going to look at are the Irish. And in discussing the Irish immigrants, I want to make it clear that the Irish entered into the United States in two waves. Okay, so that's what we call a sort of rush of immigrants who come all at the same time. We've already learned about the first wave of immigrants. The first wave of Irish immigrants were Protestant Scotch Irish. They are from Scotland and Ireland. They were Protestant, and that's going to be really important. Okay. And they all settled in the rural frontier area following the American Revolution. Okay. So we're talking about those. Those settlements that were out west past the Appalachian Mountains. Okay. These are some of the same immigrants who rebelled in the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, remember, they are upset because the Irish love their whiskey, and when Alexander Hamilton made the whiskey tax, they felt as if it was an attack on their culture. And of course, that also impacted them economically because many of these Irish immigrants out west, they're growing corn, and corn is what was used to produce whiskey. So despite the fact that they were, considered immigrants back then, what connects the original immigrants to, the English colonists and, the earlier arrivals of the English colonists was their religion, right? So both the English colonists and the earlier Irish immigrants were Protestant. And so even though they were considered foreigners initially, they had an easier time sort of adapting and adjusting in the United States. Now, the second wave of immigrants, however, will actually not be as well as accepted into America. Okay. And a lot of what that has to do with is the reason why they left Ireland to begin with. Okay. So in Ireland in 1845 to 1850, there was a major event that will push immigrants out of Ireland. Okay. So here's the thing about Ireland back in the day. All of the Irish farmers, for the most part, they solely relied on a single crop. They did not have a varying farming culture or agriculture. They only grew one food source and they relied entirely on potatoes. Okay, so these Irish farmers, all they do is grow potatoes, eat potatoes, and you can imagine how terrible it's going to be then when the potato crop goes bad. Okay, so in the 1840s, there's this plant fungus that ends up infecting about 90% of the potato crops in Ireland. And it left the potatoes, this sort of black mildewed, inedible. Okay, so the Irish farmers just, not only lost their food source, but also their source of income as well, right? So if they wanted to sell potatoes, that's gone. So we call this event the Irish Potato Famine, or what was also called the Great Famine of 1845 to 1850. Okay, now additionally to the potato famine, another major disaster that happens in Ireland was there was an outbreak of a disease called cholera that spreads very rapidly as well, and it leaves a lot of people in Ireland very, very sick. Okay, so people in Ireland don't want to live in Ireland anymore. It's pretty miserable right now. They're trying to escape the potato famine, escape cholera, and find their way to the United States. Okay, now there is a problem. The Irish are very poor. They don't have a lot of money right now, right? So their economy has been shattered. They are going through a famine. And so typically, what would happen is an Irish family would look at everyone in their family and sort of choose one, this sort of chosen individual that they would send over to the United States on what was called a coffin ship. Now, it's called a coffin ship because it's not a luxury cruise ship, okay? It's going to be very cramped, miserable conditions for this voyage. And that one person is supposed to go to the New World, go to North America, live in the United States, earn money, and then send it back home to bring the rest of the family back over to the US. Okay. Now, this just goes to show you the extent of how bad the Irish potato famine truly was. The Irish potato famine left 1 million Irish dead and another million Irish just straight up decided to leave. Okay. So, you can even see in this image of, a depiction of what this famine was like. People are suffering from poverty, starvation, that all exists because of the Irish famine. Okay. And so additionally, here's this other image of a family just kind of saying, bon voyage to that one person that they've selected to go to the United States. So imagine the type of pressure that you feel that you're this one chosen individual. You've got to go to the New World, find a job, and be successful enough to then bring the rest of your family back, over to the US. Now, while the first wave of Irish immigrants, were more or less welcome in the United States, this second wave that comes over as a result of the Irish potato famine, they are not going to be welcome. Okay, so here are two reasons why. Um, Number one, this group of Irish immigrants are Catholic, so they do not share that Protestant religion. The Irish immigrants in the 1840s and 50s are Catholic, and this is definitely a clash with the earlier wave of Irish immigrants that arrived. Okay, so number two, they are very, very poor. So they come with absolutely nothing. They have, a lot of Americans are sort of thinking, what do they have to offer to the United States? And they don't have anything. Okay, so what results because of the Irish potato famine and this huge influx of immigrants is that in the United States, you have this kind of varying level of whiteness. Okay, so there are some people who are white that are considered higher in class level, right? This hierarchy of white that others do not fit into, right? So they're considered lower. So typically speaking, British people are going to be at the top. And so if you are a white British, and you have that white British background, that puts you at the top of this hierarchy. If you are white Irish background, however, it will put you at the bottom. Okay. Now I know nowadays we don't really discuss whiteness in terms of, distinguishing whether someone's British, Irish, German, or anything like that. But back then, the Irish were very much seen as foreigners. They're not welcome in America. And it has to do with these huge numbers that are arriving in America. And so if we look at just this graph here, right, we can see that initially immigration from Ireland was pretty low, right? But then you can see as a result of the Irish potato famine that it shoots up pretty crazy, okay? And now the Irish, as a result of that, are definitely not going to be welcome. So what was the pull, and what was attracting them to America, not anywhere else in the world, right? Well, it's primarily going to be the market revolution. So with the market revolution, there's jobs in factories. Not only can Irish find jobs in factories, but they can also find jobs constructing the Union Pacific Railroad. Okay, so while the Chinese began building the Central Pacific Railroad from the West Coast in California, the Irish are going to build the Union Pacific Railroad from the East Coast, and it will head towards the West. And so the whole goal was that both will work together and then be able to meet up. Okay, so you can see this part in green is where the Chinese worked, and this part in orange is where the Irish worked. Okay, and so you might think, well, that's so unfair, right? So the Irish had to build so much more, okay, to sort of, meet up with the Chinese. Okay, but you have to remember the geography of the United States. So a lot of this region is flat. It's called the Great Plains. So they just had to lay the tracks down. The Chinese had a very difficult task of blowing through the mountains, and very dangerous, right? Using those explosives in order to build their part of the railroad. And then this blue railroad down here, this is the one that we needed the Gadsden Purchase for. Okay, so remember our goal was to build around those mountains. Okay, now the Irish are working jobs in factories and build railroad construction. But here's what they're not doing. So they're not farming. Okay, most of the Irish immigrants did not want to farm because it was too expensive or it reminded them too much of the potato famine, right? They're sort of traumatized by the potato famine. They don't want to have to try and deal with farming again. So instead, the Irish moved to major cities. They do not live in farming or sort of rural areas. They move primarily to northern cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. And not only do they move to these cities, but they help build these cities. So, they're in these factories and with construction, and they start to also build themselves Catholic churches. And so, this might be another reason why Americans are unhappy with the Irish when they arrived. So, they're not only going to be competing for jobs in major cities and industries, but they're now also building churches for their religion that sort of goes against what most American Protestants had believed. And once Irish build their churches, it's almost a sign that they're saying, we're not leaving, we're not just here to visit, we're here for good. Okay. And so building these churches, sort of indicates that they're staying there permanently. So these Catholic churches became a symbol of foreigners coming in and sort of invading the United States. Okay. Now, the third and final group of immigrants that we're going to be learning about in this time are German immigrants. So, the major push for German immigrants was a series of revolutions in Germany. And remember, we learned that in Germany, it was really divided. There were lots of kingdoms, and so Germany is still in a lot of war, and people are trying to escape that. And the pull to the United States is the hope of freedom and opportunity and the American dream. So Germans are moving to this area called the Midwest. Okay, so also it's sort of the previous Northwest Territory. And I know that it's weird to hear that this is considered the Midwest, but you have to consider that even though it's not the West at all, right? Keep in mind that the core of what the United States conception is here on the East Coast. Okay, so East Coasters are referring to the West and the Midwest. Okay, because the Midwest is technically not all the way in the West. All right. So it's not all the way towards California and stuff. So this is why it's referred to as the Midwest. But Germans, they go and move into, farms and cities, and they're totally cool working on these farms because they don't have a potato famine that traumatizes them, right? But what Germans did is they isolated themselves in their German neighborhoods. So they moved to the United States, but they still wanted to be very, very German. So they only spoke German, they used their German language, they built German schools, German newspapers, shopped German markets. So they kept very isolated and very to themselves. Okay, so this is going to bring elements of their culture though too, and kind of recreate parts of Germany here in America. So for example, they bring German traditions, the Christmas tree for example. They also bring their alcohol of choice, so they bring beer, which now is certainly a big part of American culture now. Some of the foods, like hamburgers and hot dogs, believe it or not, have German roots. So, the reason why Germans decided to eventually break away from their isolation is actually going to take a while. It's going to happen in World War I and World War II. So, up until World War I, Germans remain super isolated. They're very German, but once the United States goes to war against Germany in World War I, and then again against Hitler's Germany in World War II, Germans don't want to be associated with Germany any longer, and they give up their sort of learned German language. They don't want to be associated or titled just as German anymore because that associates them with the enemy. Okay. And so they started shedding some of that German culture as the United States enters into the world wars. Now, if we take a look at those varying levels of whiteness that we previously talked about, again, the British are at the very top, the Irish are at the very bottom, the Germans are somewhere in the middle. Okay, so Americans didn't like Germans, but they didn't consider the Germans as offensive as the Irish. Now, overall, even though we're talking about immigrant groups like the Chinese, the Irish, and the Germans, it's also important to note that all throughout the 1800s, especially in the first half, There was just an overall anti immigrant sentiment, and many Americans don't like immigrants coming into the United States at all. In fact, they were so against it that they created a political party that is going to try and fight against further immigration. And it was referred to as the Know Nothing Party. Okay, so it's created in 1845. So perfect timing, right? It's when the Chinese are coming, when the Irish potato famine happens, and essentially the Know Nothing Party is an anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant group. And the whole thing was that they wanted to preserve the United States for native born Americans. Okay. And the reason why they called themselves the Know Nothing Party is because when people ask them what their party is about, they would just say, I don't know. Right. So I don't know anything. Right. So it was fairly racist and discriminatory. And, they aren't going to come out and sort of admit that. Right. And I think that this flag is very ironic because it says Native Americans beware of foreign influence. And when, we see this flag, Native Americans, it's not talking about Indian tribes, right? So Native Americans in that sense, right? This is referring to white Americans who were born in America and see themselves as native to the United States. Okay, so it says beware foreign influence. Imagine the irony considering the actual Native Americans who, truly should be wary of the foreign influence back in, the 1400s and 1500s, right? So we call this belief that America was reserved for native foreigners or, native born white Americans as nativist ideals. Okay. So that's the term that we'll use over and over as nativist. Now, one of the major reasons why the Know Nothings became so popular is because they saw immigrants as diluting American culture or sort of bringing bad things to the United States. Okay, so many immigrants are considered drunkards because, the Irish show up and they're drinking whiskey and Germans bring over their beer. And, we're going through the Second Great Awakening. We want everybody to be moral, God fearing Americans, Protestant. And these immigrants are just messing all of that up. And so the Know Nothing Party has these goals of banning Catholics and immigrants from holding any political office. And they ultimately wanted to extend the requirement for citizenship for up to 21 years. So you would have to wait to live in the United States for 21 years after immigrating if you wanted to even apply for citizenship. Okay, so this racism is very blatant in many ways, in many different areas. There's help wanted signs, for example, in storefronts that say, we need workers, but Irish can't apply, right? So don't even try applying because, you're Irish. So the final group that we're going to discuss in 12.1 are not actually immigrants at all. Okay, so Mexican residents who lived in Mexico but were sort of adopted into the United States as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All of those Mexicans living in land that previously, belonged to Mexico, um, they right are going to be sort of given to the United States. They had a choice whether or not they wanted American citizenship or Mexican citizenship. Okay, so if they chose Mexican citizenship, they would have to go back to Mexico. Okay, so however, if they want to remain in parts of the United States now, living in like California, for example, and Texas in particular, right? Um, Now you have to understand, many of them don't have this particular strong draw to Mexico, right, or the Mexican government. So a lot of them are going to decide to stay in the United States and keep American citizenship instead. Okay. So they sort of stay on the lands where they previously were living before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, before it becomes the United States. Now, these Mexican residents who stayed in California and Texas, they're going to face a lot of difficulties. And the reason why is because in these sort of two regions of, California and, Texas and stuff in particular, um, they're going to be sort of outnumbered by white Americans. Okay, so white Americans are going to outnumber Mexican Americans in places like Texas. And the reason is because of those empresarios, right? So the Texians who moved to Texas in search of more land out west, in the name of manifest destiny in California, we have the gold rush. So white Americans from all over the United States are flooding into California. You have a large group in California, and so, or excuse me, Texas as well. So Mexicans are already the minority by the time we get to the 1840s and the 1850s. And so any Mexican residents who had any sort of power previously, in government, or they hold some sort of office, they lose that power. They lose that authority. And they end up losing their land because in order to keep their land, they had to have paperwork that proved that their land ownership was legitimate with the United States, but they don't have it, right? So much of the power and the land is going to be stripped away from those Mexican populations. The one place where Mexicans sort of still were able to maintain some of their original power is actually in New Mexico, because New Mexico was really never a destination that white Americans were moving out west for. Their goal was to get to Texas or to get to California for the gold rush. Okay, so very few people leave the East Coast and say, you know what, I want to go to New Mexico. Okay, if anything else, they just sort of pass through New Mexico. They don't see it as their final destination. So Mexican residents were able to retain some power there in New Mexico when they weren't able to hold it in California and Texas. Okay, so that just goes to show us that the United States during these decades, the way it looks sort of is very different in composition as far as who is an American, right? It looks different because we have immigrants coming from different parts of the world. And now another group that we're going to see a lot of changes with or during this time period is slaves. Okay, so 12.1, slavery in the United States, the 1840s and 1850s, explain how the slaveholders and abolitionists evolved in the decades before the Civil War. Now, remember, we had mentioned an abolitionist is someone who wants to abolish or get rid of slavery. So abolitionists are very morally opposed to slavery, especially as the Second Great Awakening is going on. So they see slavery as a moral wrong, and more Northerners are starting to become abolitionists. So some of them might become abolitionists because they see slaves as competition for jobs. So maybe if we didn't have slavery, some of those plantation owners could just hire white workers to cultivate cotton instead, okay? And then other Northerners decided that they were sort of okay with slavery where it existed. They just didn't want to see the expansion of slavery into the new territories that were acquired in Manifest Destiny. And so those individuals called or created political parties like the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party. Okay, so we kind of already learned about the Free Soil Party with Martin Van Buren when he tries to run for president. But overall, what we say is that during the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, more Northerners are starting to see slavery as a bad thing for various reasons. So it could be moral, it could be economic with jobs, but Northerners are turning away from slavery. Okay. Now, Northerners, however, totally disagree. Southerners, however, totally disagree. Okay, so Southerners see slavery as something that's very positive. Okay, now before many Southerners, could admit that slavery was bad, right? Slavery is bad, but we need it. Okay, so that's what they probably would have said, right? So it's bad, but we need it economically, right? So we understand that it's not cool for one person to own another, but we needed to run the economy. So their mentality was sort of like, what can we do about it? Okay, so think about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington sort of accepting the fact that slavery exists in the South. Okay, but now slaveholders are actually saying slavery is a good thing now. Okay, so what slaves are getting, as far as Southern slave owners now are saying, is they're getting things like religion and food and shelter and an orderly life. And they may not have access to any of this stuff if slavery didn't exist. Okay, so Southern slave owners are trying to argue that slavery in the South was superior than the way in which Northern workers were being treated by factory owners. So Southerners thought Northern factory owners were, treating their workers worse. They were worse off because you had little children that you can see in these sort of images here that are working in these factories, right? As coal miners and textile, factory workers. They were earning little wages, maybe not even enough to support themselves or their families. Maybe they can't afford food or rent. And they could also be fired at any time, and their conditions are so dangerous. So the justification was at least slaves get to work forever, right? They're never going to be fired, that they have job security until many Southerners started, using this rhetoric and using this, type of language to sort of justify slavery. Okay. Now, a lot of this has to do with the fact that slavery is more valuable now than ever before, because with the growing value of cotton, obviously slaveholders need the slaves to make sure that their slaves are well fed and they're well taken care of in order to cultivate that cotton. Okay, so Southerners are going to make more money, and because slaves are more valuable, now the treatment in the slaves does improve in some way. Okay, so I'm not saying that slavery is at all good, right? So I'm just giving you the justification of what Southerners would have said. Okay, so there were laws against, for example, things like murdering slaves. And, that wasn't developed because of the fact that they were protecting slaves. Because when you kill your slave, right, you can't grow cotton. So, there's this idea that, housing is provided for slaves, and, slave quarters diets are including meat because slaveholders need their slaves to be strong and healthy, right? So slaves get Sundays off. They don't have to work. They don't have to work until, the age of 10 to 12. Whereas in the North, the justification was factory owners who are hiring these little kids and going into these dangerous factories from a young age. Slave owners, holders started thinking, man, we haven't even imported slaves since 1808, right? Because remember, the Constitution outlaws international slave trade in 1808, but the population of slaves is increasing to 4 million by 1860. So if slaves are living longer, having more kids, the whole reasoning that Southerners had is like, hey, they must be living better lives. There are all these reasons why slaveholders are sort of justifying that slavery is a sort of positive in the South. Okay, now let's be real. We know that no matter how you spin it, slavery is bad. Okay, so it's extremely horrible. But we'll talk about some of those negative conditions for the Southern slaves, right? So, yes, they got improved housing, right, in some aspects, but a lot of that housing was actually hot and stuffy and flammable, which means that it's going to easily set fire. And we're in the American South where it gets super hot and humid in the summer. Slaves are still going to be doing backbreaking work, growing, harvesting, and picking cotton. Families are often separated and sold off into different plantations. Slave women are regularly raped, right? And it wouldn't be something outrageous to hear of a story of a slave woman being raped. And all of these, negative consequences and punishments are happening to slaves. And blacks, right, slaves, they can't testify in court and say that, these conditions are horrible, right? So there's no legal recourse for the negative treatment against slaves. So even though, murder of a slave is outlawed, if somebody actually witnesses a murder of a slave, it's actually not even going to go anywhere. Nothing's going to get prosecuted, or, a white person is going to end up in jail because of it. Okay. Now, there's definitely different types of working environments depending on the size of the plantations that slaves are working on. Smaller farms, it's harder for slaves to communicate with other slaves because their owners are watching them all the time very closely. But on larger plantations, they are controlled typically by what we call an overseer. Okay, and so the overseer is not the slave owner. It is a person who is hired by the slave owner to sort of act as a similar to a manager. Okay, so it was easier for slaves to sort of create these communities on large plantations. There are more slaves and there's more opportunities on a plantation to create the community to communicate with one another. Okay. Now, something that many of the slaves would talk about is the possibility of escaping slavery from the South. Okay. And many tried to run away. And the consequences for attempting to leave a plantation are very harsh. Slaves could be flogged or whipped. And you could see from this, really graphic picture here, right? They would be killed, families could be separated. Another punishment is even just sort of selling slaves to a plantation to another state that's just sort of worse. Okay, where worse conditions were for slaves like deeper in the South. And so slaves who ran away would have to face these consequences. Now, some tried to escape using the Underground Railroad. Okay, now, some people, when learning about the Underground Railroad, might actually think it was like a subway, like a secret train that's underground that slaves could hop in on, and off of, and they would be taken to, safety in the North. And that's not the case. Okay, so the Underground Railroad was a sort of network of secret paths that would lead runaway slaves to the North. And many time Northern abolitionists and runaway slaves would act as conductors and help these slaves to sort of get their freedom in the North. Okay, now some of these slaves didn't, just want to get to the North. They wanted to get as far into, Canada, because Canada is a completely different country. Okay, so they wouldn't be returned back to their owners there. All right. Now, two individuals who will be very important in helping these runaway slaves are Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. So, two huge names in the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass is a runaway slave from Maryland, and he's an abolitionist who wrote his autobiography. And this is going to be important. So, when Douglass writes his autobiography and starts explaining all of the conditions that he goes through, what he sees, what he witnesses, all of the atrocities that happens to him and other slaves, Northerners read about it, right? And the Northerners are going to see a firsthand account of how bad slavery truly is. Because many Northerners, are kind of out of sight, out of mind. Sure, they know slavery is bad, but they don't know how bad it is or how bad it's become. So, reading Frederick Douglass's autobiography is going to be something that starts changing their minds. And then Harriet Tubman, of course, is a famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. So she's a runaway slave and she ran away to the North. But when she gets to the North, she realizes freedom doesn't matter, right? If there isn't anybody to sort of be free with, if she doesn't have her, family and friends around her, freedom doesn't mean anything. It's a very lonely life. So she actually goes back to the South that had enslaved her, and she helps free 200 to 300 additional runaway slaves using that underground network of the Underground Railroad. Okay. And because of the Fugitive Slave Act that we're going to learn about in the next chapter, it requires Northerners to sort of return runaway slaves to the South. She found it more prudent, right? It's more appropriate to start taking groups of runaway slaves to Canada, outside of the country where they can't be returned. Now, of course, running away is definitely one of the many conversations that slaves are going to have in their communities on those plantations. But another option was simply to rebel against their slave owners. Okay, so there's two famous rebellions that you guys should know about. The first rebellion plan was by Denmark Vesey in 1822. Okay, and Denmark Vesey was a freed slave who was literate, so he knew how to read and write, and he planned a slave revolt in South Carolina. Now, this whole goal was to get slaves to uprise, fight back against their owners, and then move them to Haiti. Okay, so why Haiti? Because Haiti is where there was actually a successful slave rebellion, where slaves had actually drove the French colonizers out. Okay, but Denmark Vesey was captured and killed, so his revolt doesn't really get to happen. But it's still very important because it shows us that no matter what the Southerners say, slavery is bad. Because if it was as good as they had argued, right, why are slaves actually trying to rebel against their owners? Now, Another slave rebellion is Nat Turner's Rebellion. And Nat Turner's Rebellion occurred in 1831, and it is considered one of the most successful slave rebellions in American history. Okay, so Nat Turner was able to march around Virginia, and you can see some of the images here, right? He goes around Virginia sort of freeing slaves, okay, arming slaves, and then they kill over 60 whites. Okay, and that's why it's considered to be a successful rebellion because it led to the deaths of white Americans. The white militias and mobs stopped Nat Turner's rebellion and killed over 100 slaves to stop Nat Turner. Okay, now with these rebellions occurring, of course, the slave owners are starting to get worried. And one thing they realize about both Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, what they had in common is that they were both inspired by religion and that both of these men knew how to read. So maybe that's what's giving them these ideas, right? So they're communicating with each other with letters and writing, and from time to time slave owners are actually going to start outlawing literacy for their slaves, and they're no longer going to allow slaves to learn how to read or write because they think reading and writing is going to lead to ideas like freedom. Okay. Now, so far, these abolitionists, what we've learned about, or these people that want to abolish slavery have been African Americans and they've been slaves. However, there are white abolitionists too. And I think it's very important to note that, there are white abolitionists. And one of the most famous is this man, William Lloyd Garrison. Okay, so William Lloyd Garrison, he wrote something called The Liberator, which is a publication in 1831 outlining his ideas for abolishing slavery. He also created the American Anti Slavery Society. It was a radical idea for the time. He wanted the total abolition of slavery everywhere in the United States right now. So, not a gradual abolition, not just limiting slavery in certain areas, not others. He said slavery should not exist in America, period. Okay. Now, his motives are a little different from others or some of the other abolitionists. The reason why he was such a strong abolitionist is because he believed in something called free labor, not slave labor. Okay, so essentially, those who believe in free labor see slaves as competition for jobs. So, what that means is William Lloyd Garrison wanted free whites to do the jobs, not enslaved Africans to do jobs. Okay, so that is what the idea of free labor means. So many white Americans actually become abolitionists because of their belief in free labor. William Lloyd Garrison ultimately will show his disdain for slavery entirely by burning a copy of the Fugitive Slave Act, which required the return of runaway slaves to the US, or sorry, to the South, and the US Constitution, because both of these documents protected the institution of slavery in the United States. Okay, now ultimately, even though William Lloyd Garrison was a strong abolitionist, he was also a pacifist. So he believed that there had to be a way to abolish slavery without violence and without going to war. And it's very important to note that he was a pacifist because we're going to be talking about William Lloyd Garrison in the future and how he ultimately will end up changing his mind. All right. So, the abolitionist movement is going to be very much influenced by religion. So, the Second Great Awakening is going on at the same time, right? It's going on right now, and many preachers are preaching that slavery is a sin, and that they, hold these large religious revivals, and that became sort of abolitionist revivals too, or abolitionist rallies too. And preachers started to share that they saw slavery as morally wrong. Okay, now remember the Second Great Awakening, it's not good enough to just convert to a religion. Your actions had to demonstrate that you had converted by devoting yourself to a cause. Okay, and so that cause could be prohibition or, getting rid of alcohol. It could be prison reform. But a very popular cause was the abolition movement as well. Okay. Now, the final group of individuals we're going to discuss today are women. So, in 12.3, new strength for American women. describe how the women's rights movement developed in the United States in the 1830s and 40s. Now, before learning, about women, I'd like to sort of address, the changes that women were demanding. I do want to tell you the state of women and what that was like in the 1800s, what we call the 19th century. Before we said women were bound to that idea of Republican motherhood, that women needed rights and education so they could raise patriotic men in their family. Okay. Now, Republican motherhood has been replaced by this new idea called the cult of domesticity. Okay, now, if you think about this word of domesticity, right, it lends itself to domestic. Okay, so domestic meaning home. And so the cult of domesticity is this popular idea during the 19th century, particularly among white Protestant upper and middle class families. The cult of domesticity argues that women's role is in the house and with the family, and that their job is to focus on housekeeping and raising good children. Okay, so they should not leave the house, and women are incapable of effectively participating in politics, commerce, or public service. Okay, so in the cult of domesticity, it's essentially that women stay home, that's where you belong. Okay, now we are definitely going to see a fight against the cult of domesticity with the signing of the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. So essentially, the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions is a document similar to the Declaration of Independence, and it represents the entire women's rights movement during the 1840s. Okay, so you could see right here that it sort of borrows language from the Declaration of Independence. So we hold these truths to be self evident, that all men and women are created equal, right? That they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so the Declaration of Sentiments is a version of the Declaration of Independence that empowers women, that will be signed at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And we'll get to that very shortly. Okay, now, two early leaders of the women's rights movement are the Grimke sisters. Okay, and so the Grimke sisters are Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who are from South Carolina. But even though South Carolina is a slave state, I know it's very ironic, right? They are abolitionists, and they joined the American Anti Slavery Society. Okay. Now, here presented a problem. The Grimke sisters are abolitionists. They are a part of the American Anti Slavery Society, but they're not allowed to speak out against slavery because remember, according to the cult of domesticity, they should be at home. They shouldn't be participating in politics. They shouldn't be sharing their opinion. And because of that, the Grimke sisters published letters on the equality of the sexes in 1838, which in itself was very radical and revolutionary. They argued whatever it is that's morally right for a man to do is morally right for a woman to do. If a man could be against slavery because they think slavery is bad, a woman should be able to be against slavery too. And both of these women were highly criticized for speaking publicly on the topics of both women's rights and abolition. Okay, but the Grimke sisters were two very early voices in the women's rights movement. Now, this movement is going to gain traction and it'll come to a peak in the 1840s at the Seneca Falls Convention. So, the Seneca Falls Convention is held in 1848 and it's led by two women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who, similarly to the Grimke sisters, are very active in the anti slavery movement. Okay, so again, they weren't allowed to publicly speak on this topic because they are women, right? And the cult of domesticity says that they should not be involved in politics at all. So they have no sort of public place to do this. They are supposed to stay at home, right? They should just stay at home. So Stanton and Mott came up with this idea. How about we have a convention that's just for women? Because if it's just for women, then who's going to tell us to be quiet and go home? Okay, so that's where this idea for the Seneca Falls Convention is born. So they met in New York And at this women's rights convention, they're going to be able to talk about many different topics. Okay. Now, even though this is primarily for women's rights, there were people who weren't women, so men, who also supported the women's rights movement and were in attendance, like Frederick Douglass. So, Frederick Douglass, again, is a runaway slave and abolitionist. He attended the Seneca Falls Convention because there was actually a connection between the abolition movement and the women's rights movement. So both were excluded from leadership positions. Both were a part of the reform movements for sort of greater, second great awakening. And you could see even in this sort of emblem right here, right? It says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Right? For the slaves, or a reference to the slaves. And "Am I not a woman and a sister?" in reference to women. And so while most people in attendance were women, there were others like Frederick Douglass who were advocates for women's rights as well. So here are some of the topics that were discussed at Seneca Falls. Number one, the right for women to control their own property. So women were not able to own their own land. All of their land always had to be in the name of men in their family. So, for example, a woman would have to have her dad's name on her land or her husband's name on the land. A woman could never own land all by herself. Okay. Women are also anti prostitution. We know that women, especially with Manifest Destiny and westward expansion, prostitution was on the rise. And so, women were kind of getting tricked into becoming prostitutes out in places like California. They also discussed things like dietary reform, how to change the diet, but it's not like, okay, eat more vegetables and, be gluten free. It was more about pushing for no alcohol. Okay, so alcohol consumption was very high in the 1800s, especially during Jacksonian democracy. So they wanted to begin this movement of prohibiting alcohol in the United States. But first and foremost, the primary reason that they were there is for the right to vote. And so Susan B. Anthony is going to be a huge advocate for women's suffrage. So I know that the word suffrage sounds something terrible because it sounds like you're suffering, but suffrage is simply the right to vote. And so women realized at the Seneca Falls Convention they can't, right? So much of the stuff, they can't really do much for because they don't have the right to vote and they can't make decisions at the ballot. So I think that this particular picture is sort of very interesting and exciting because Susan B. Anthony never lived to see women gain the right to vote. But you have all of these "I voted" stickers from women all over the nation that put on her tombstone these stickers sort of in gratitude of what Susan B. Anthony fought for. Okay. Now, despite the many sort of agreements that women had at the Seneca Falls Convention, there were also disagreements. Some women didn't know how they felt on topics of marriage and divorce, especially during the Second Great Awakening. With this sort of dominant cult of domesticity, some women believed that despite the circumstances, they should always remain with their husbands, remain loyal to their families, right? While others believed that divorce should be allowed. Another major disagreement that existed is definitely based on race. So, white women had all of the sort of leadership roles in the women's rights movement, and African American women did not have access to these leadership roles. Because remember, as we stated before, Black women have a sort of double discrimination against them. Not only are they women, they are also Black. And during this time period, if they're, probably Black, that means that they're also enslaved. Okay, so they face extra sort of obstacles and discrimination that white women could never understand. All right, so we just covered three major groups. I know that that was long, okay, and so thank you for bearing with me. We looked at immigrants, we looked at slavery, and we also looked at women and how these topics sort of went through the changes during the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, okay? And so all of these changes will ultimately lead us to the American Civil War, which is the major topic of Unit 3. All right, so thank you for sitting through this, and I'll see you all next time.